It's just after midnight on November 16th, 1989, and the University of Central America, UCA, in San Salvador, El Salvador, is wrapped in an uneasy silence. The campus, nestled in the heart of a city on edge, is usually a sanctuary of ideas, a place where students debate justice over cups of bitter coffee and professors challenge the status quo with fiery lectures. But tonight, something feels wrong. The air is thick with tension. The distant crack of gunfire, a grim reminder of the civil war tearing the country apart. In the Jesuit priest's dorm, a modest concrete building tucked behind the main library, 6 men are awake, their voices low but urgent. Ignacio Ellacuría, the rector of UCA, sits at a desk littered with books on liberation theology. His brow furrowed as he scribbles notes. His 5 colleagues, Segundo Montes, Ignacio Martín Baró, Armando López, Juan Ramón Moreno, and Joaquín López y López, gather around a small table, their faces lit by a flickering lamp, discussing a plan to push for peace in a war that's claimed over 70,000 lives. Across the courtyard, in a small staff apartment, Julia Elba Ramos, a 42-year-old housekeeper who keeps the dorm spotless, is tucking her 16-year-old daughter Selena into bed. Julia whispers a prayer for safety, her hands calloused from years of work, while Selena, a bright girl who dreams of studying at UCA one day, clutches a worn textbook. By dawn, the dorm is empty, beds untouched, books scattered, a half-drunk cup of coffee cold on Ellacuria's desk. The priests are gone, and so are Julia and Selena. The campus, once buzzing with ideas, feels like a ghost town. Whispers spread through San Salvador. Were they kidnapped by rebels? Did they flee the violence? Or did something far worse happen under the cover of night? For 31 years the truth stayed buried, a wound that refused to heal for El Salvador and the world that watched. Then, in 2020, a judge in a Spanish courtroom uncovered a secret so shocking it shook the foundations of justice, a revelation that exposed a calculated act of violence orchestrated by those meant to protect. What really happened to the priests of UCA and who wanted them gone? What's up, story lovers? Welcome to Storyroom by Rico, where we bring you gripping tales that'll keep you hooked. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss a story. Also, let us know in the comments section where you are watching from. Stay with us, because this mystery runs deeper than you'd ever guess, weaving through a war-torn nation, foreign powers, and a fight for truth that refused to die. Let's rewind to 1989, when El Salvador was a land on the brink of collapse, and the University of Central America stood as a beacon of hope in the chaos. The country had been locked in a brutal civil war since 1979, a conflict that pitted the US-backed government against the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front, FMLN, a coalition of leftist rebels fighting for the poor. By 1989, over 70,000 people had lost their lives. Farmers gunned down in their fields, children caught in crossfire, shopkeepers disappeared for speaking out. San Salvador, the capital, was a pressure cooker, its streets patrolled by soldiers in camouflage, their rifles slung low, while FMLN guerrillas struck from the shadows, planting bombs and ambushing military convoys. Amid this violence, UCA was a rare safe haven, a campus of 8,000 students where ideas about justice, equality and peace flourished despite the bloodshed outside its gates. The university, founded by Jesuits in 1965, was a place where the poor could study, where professors challenged the government's iron-fisted policies, and where the Catholic Church's call for social justice found a loud voice. At the heart of UCA were 6 Jesuit priests, men whose faith drove them to confront the war head-on. Father Ignacio Ellacuría, 59, was the rector, a Spanish-born philosopher with a sharp mind and a fearless heart, known for his writings on liberation theology, a belief that faith demands action for the oppressed. Father Segundo Montes, 54, focused on the war's impact on migration, advocating for displaced families forced to flee. Father Ignacio Martín Baró, 47, a psychologist, studied the mental toll of oppression, his research exposing how violence scarred entire communities. Father Armando Lopez, 54, taught theology, urging students to see God's love as a call for fairness. Father Juan Ramón Moreno, 55, was a poet and scholar, his words inspiring hope in the darkest times. Father Joaquín López y López, 71, the eldest, had founded UCA and worked tirelessly for education reform, even as his health declined. These men weren't just academics. They wrote articles condemning military abuses, gave radio talks calling for peace, and even tried to broker talks between the government and the FMLN. To the poor, they were heroes, voices for the voiceless in a country where speaking out could get you killed. To the powerful, they were a threat, their ideas a challenge to a regime that thrived on fear. The priests lived in a modest dorm on campus, a simple building with narrow beds, wooden desks, and shelves stuffed with books. They shared meals with students, laughed over bad coffee, and prayed together each morning, their faith unshaken by the war outside. Julia Elba Ramos, the housekeeper, kept their space spotless, her hands rough from scrubbing floors, her smile warm as she chatted with the priests about her daughter, Selena, a bright 16-year-old who often helped her mother after school. Selena dreamed of studying at UCA, inspired by the priest's teachings, her worn textbooks filled with notes in the margins. But in a war where ideas were as dangerous as bullets, the priest's courage made them targets. What made them so dangerous? To those in power and who wanted their voices silenced. The 6 priests at UCA weren't just men of faith. They were fearless advocates whose ideas shook the foundations of El Salvador's war machine. Father Ignacio Ellacuría, the rector, was the driving force, a man whose belief in liberation. Theology made him a thorn in the government side. Born in Spain in 1930, Ellacuría had seen the horrors of the Spanish Civil War as a child, shaping his lifelong commitment to justice. He moved to El Salvador in the 1950s, joining the Jesuits, and eventually becoming UCA's rector in 1979, just as the Civil War erupted. His writings called for a preferential option for the poor, arguing that true faith meant standing with the oppressed, even if it meant defying the powerful. Ellacuría's speeches on national radio were electrifying. He accused the military of massacres, demanded land reform, and pushed for peace talks, even meeting with FMLN leaders to negotiate ceasefires. Father Segundo Montes, born in Valladolid, Spain, in 1935, focused on the war's human toll, particularly its impact on migration. He interviewed families forced to flee to Honduras or the US, documenting their stories in reports that exposed the military's role in displacing entire villages. Father Ignacio Martín Baró, a 47-year-old psychologist, was a pioneer in liberation psychology, studying how state violence and poverty scarred the minds of Salvadorans. His work published in journals that reached global audiences. Father Armando Lopez, a 54-year-old theology professor, taught his students that God's love demanded action, fair wages, access to education, an end to repression. Father Juan Ramón Moreno, 55, used his poetry to inspire hope. His verses read aloud at student rallies, while Father Joaquín López y López, 71, the founder of UCA, worked behind the scenes to secure funding for scholarships, ensuring the poor could study despite the war. Together, they were a force, their ideas spreading far beyond UCA's walls. They mentored students like Ana Morales, a 20-year-old sociology major in 1989, who'd grown up in a rural village where soldiers burned homes to root out rebels. Ina idolized Ellacuría, attending his lectures with a notebook full of questions, dreaming of a day when El Salvador could heal. The priests' influence reached the poor in San Salvador's slums, where they held workshops on human rights, teaching farmers and workers to demand better lives. But their boldness came at a cost. Death squads, shadowy groups tied to the military, roamed the country, targeting anyone deemed a threat. Priests were no exception. Archbishop Oscar Romero, a vocal critic of the government, had been assassinated in 1980 while saying Mass, a murder that sent a clear message: speak out and you'll pay. The UCA priests knew the risks, but they refused to back down. Why did they keep pushing, even with danger closing in? The answer lies in a war where ideas could be deadlier than guns, and in the foreign powers pulling the strings from afar. El Salvador's civil war wasn't just a local conflict, it was a proxy battle in the Cold War, with the United States playing a heavy hand. By 1989, the US was terrified of communism spreading in Latin America, especially after Nicaragua's Sandinista revolution a decade earlier. The FMLN, with its Marxist leanings, set off alarm bells in Washington, which saw El Salvador as a domino that couldn't fall. So the US poured money into the Salvadoran government, over $1 million a day by 1989, totaling $4 billion over the war, arming its military to crush the rebels. The US also trained elite units like the Atlacatl Battalion, a group of 1,000 soldiers known for their discipline and ruthlessness. Formed in 1981 with American advisors at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, the Atlacatl were taught counterinsurgency tactics, how to hunt guerrillas, interrogate suspects, and strike fear into communities. But their missions often went beyond rebels, targeting civilians, union leaders, and even priests who spoke out. The U.S. Embassy in San Salvador, led by Ambassador William Walker in 1989, knew about the Atlacatl's brutal tactics but turned a blind eye, prioritizing anti-communism over human rights. A mid-level embassy official, David Carter, a 35-year-old diplomat from Ohio, was stationed in San Salvador that year. Carter, who'd joined the Foreign Service to make a difference, kept a private journal, later discovered in a 2015 declassification, where he wrote about his unease. He'd heard whispers of Atlacatl operations targeting subversives at UCA, but his superiors dismissed his concerns, telling him to focus on the bigger picture. The Cold War's shadow loomed large. President George H.W. Bush's administration feared that any crackdown on the Salvadoran military would weaken their ally, letting the FMLN gain ground. When the FMLN launched a massive offensive on San Salvador in November 1989, hitting military bases and wealthy neighborhoods, the government panicked. The offensive, one of the largest of the war, showed the rebels' strength, and the military lashed out, seeing enemies everywhere. UCA's priests, with their loud calls for peace and justice, were labeled as threats, their ideas seen as fuel for the rebellion. High-ranking officers, trained by the US, met in secret, deciding the priests had to be silenced. But who gave the final order? And how did it lead to that fateful night? If you're still watching, you need to subscribe. The trail points to a unit that didn't ask questions and a plan that unfolded in the dark. November 16, 1989 started like any other day at UCA, but by nightfall, it became a turning point. In El Salvador's history, the FMLN's offensive, launched 5 days earlier, had San Salvador on lockdown. Soldiers patrolled every corner, helicopters buzzed overhead, and the city's residents huddled in their homes, fearing the next explosion. At UCA, the mood was tense but resolute. Students gathered in the library, debating the war's latest developments, while the priests met in their dorm to plan their next move. Father Ellacuría, who'd been negotiating with both sides for a ceasefire, was drafting a new proposal, his desk piled high with papers. Father Martín Baró, the psychologist, was reviewing notes for a lecture on trauma, hoping to help students cope with the violence. Around 10 p.m., a student, Ana Morales, left the library, passing the priest's dorm on her way to her dorm room. She later recalled hearing laughter through an open window, Father Moreno reciting a poem, the others chuckling softly. It was the last time anyone saw them alive. At 11:30 p.m., the Atlacatl Battalion, led by Lieutenant José Ricardo Espinosa Guerra, moved in. The unit, 50 men strong, had been dispatched from their base on orders from Colonel Guillermo Alfredo Benavides, the director of the military academy. Benavides had received a direct order from higher up, later traced to Colonel Inocente Orlando Montano, a senior officer in the Ministry of Defense, to eliminate the priests, whom the military believed were masterminding the FMLN offensive. The soldiers crept onto campus, their faces blackened with grease paint, rifles at the ready. They surrounded the dorm, cutting phone lines and disabling the campus generator, plunging the area into darkness. At 11:45 p.m., they kicked in the dorm door, dragging the 6 priests out of their rooms. Father Ellacuría tried to reason with them, his hands raised, but a soldier struck him with a rifle butt, silencing him. Across the courtyard, Julia Elba Ramos and her daughter Selena heard the commotion and hid under their bed, but the soldiers found them, pulling them into the night. What happened next was a calculated act of brutality. Each priest was shot. Multiple times, their bodies left on the grass near the dorm, staged to look like a rebel attack. Julia and Selena, witnesses to the soldiers' presence, were also killed, their lives snuffed out to ensure silence. The soldiers left a fake FMLN sign, "Death to Imperialists," to frame the rebels, then melted back into the night. A groundskeeper, Miguel Ortiz, hiding in a nearby shed, heard the gunshots and saw the soldiers leave, their boots thudding against the pavement. By dawn, the campus was a crime scene, the bodies discovered by a student who screamed for help. How could such a massacre happen in a place of learning, and who would go to such lengths to cover it up? The discovery of the bodies at UCA sent shockwaves far beyond San Salvador, igniting a global firestorm that refused to die down. At 6 a.m. on November 16, 1989, a student named Carlos Rivera, a 21-year-old engineering major, stumbled upon the scene while walking to an early class. The 6 priests lay sprawled on the grass, their blood soaking into the earth, their faces frozen in expressions of fear and defiance. Nearby, Julia Elba Ramos and her daughter Selena were found, their arms wrapped around each other in a final embrace. Carlos's screams brought others running, students, professors, campus staff, all staring in horror at the carnage. Word spread like wildfire, and by noon, San Salvador's streets were filled with protesters, thousands marching to the presidential palace chanting, "Justicia para los Jesuitas." Justice for the Jesuits, the Salvadoran government, led by President Alfredo Cristiani, quickly blamed the FMLN, pointing to the fake sign left by the soldiers as proof of rebel involvement. But the evidence didn't add up. Military shell casings littered the scene, and Miguel Ortiz, the groundskeeper, came forward, telling police he'd seen soldiers, not guerrillas, fleeing the campus. The UCA massacre became front-page news worldwide, with headlines in the New York Times, Le Monde, and The Guardian screaming about the Jesuit murders. In Washington, D.C., Congress held emergency hearings, questioning U.S. support for El Salvador's military. Human rights groups like Amnesty International and America's Watch descended on San Salvador, documenting the crime scene and interviewing witnesses. A Salvadoran journalist, Luis Hernandez, a 30-year-old reporter for El Diario de Hoy, risked his life to investigate, publishing articles that accused the military of a cover-up. Luis interviewed Ana Morales, the student who'd heard the priests laughing hours before their deaths, and her testimony, published in a 1990 exposé, kept the case alive, even as death threats forced Luis to flee to Mexico. The international pressure was relentless. Pope John Paul II condemned the killings, calling the priests martyrs for justice, while global leaders demanded accountability. The US, which had funneled billions to the Salvadoran military, faced a public relations nightmare. Ambassador William Walker claimed ignorance, but David Carter's declassified journal entries, later revealed in 2015, showed he'd warned his superiors about Atlacatl's targeting of UCA, only to be ignored. The massacre didn't just expose El Salvador's violence, it forced the world to confront the cost of Cold War politics, where priests and civilians became collateral damage. But with the military stonewalling and witnesses too scared to talk, justice seemed out of reach. What kept this case from fading into history? Subscribe to Storyroom by Rico for the extraordinary conclusion. For 31 years, the UCA massacre remained. A scar on El Salvador's conscience, a symbol of the war's brutality and the long road to justice. In 1991, a Salvadoran investigation, pressured by international outcry, confirmed the Atlacatl battalion's role. Colonel Guillermo Alfredo Benavides and Lieutenant José Ricardo Espinosa Guerra were convicted, sentenced to 30 years each. But they were low-level scapegoats. The masterminds remained untouchable. In 1993, an amnesty law passed by El Salvador's government granted immunity to war criminals, slamming the door on further prosecutions and letting killers walk free. The Jesuits' allies, including UCA professors and human rights lawyers, refused to give up. They turned to Spain, where Father Ellacuría held citizenship, and in 2011, the Spanish National Court charged 20 Salvadoran military officers with crimes against humanity. Most stayed out of reach, protected by El Salvador's amnesty, but one slipped up. Colonel Inocente Orlando Montano, a senior officer in 1989, now 77, was arrested in the US in 2017 for immigration fraud. Extradited to Spain, Montano faced trial in Madrid in 2020, 31 years after the massacre. The trial was a marathon. Witnesses like Ana Morales, now 51, testified about the priest's final night, her voice trembling as she recalled their laughter. Miguel Ortiz, the groundskeeper, now 68, described the soldiers he saw, his hands shaking as he spoke via video link. Court documents revealed chilling details. Montano, as Deputy Minister of Defense, had attended a meeting on November 15, 1989, where high-ranking officers, including the Minister of Defense, ordered the priest's elimination, believing they were orchestrating the FMLN offensive. US-trained soldiers carried out the plan, with orders to leave no witnesses. Julia and Selena were killed to ensure silence. Montano's defense claimed he was just following orders, but the judge rejected his plea, sentencing him to 133 years on September 11, 2020, for the murders of the 6 priests, Julia and Selena. The conviction was a breakthrough but not a full victory. Most of the 20 charged officers remained free, and El Salvador's amnesty law still stood, though the 2020 ruling inspired activists to push for its repeal. The trial's impact rippled through El Salvador. Survivors of war atrocities came forward, demanding their own justice, and UCA became a rallying point for reform, its students leading protests against impunity. The 6 priests, Julia and Selena, became symbols of resilience, their deaths a catalyst for change in a nation still healing. What does their legacy mean for El Salvador today, and how does it inspire us all? The 6 priests of UCA didn't vanish into darkness. Their lives were stolen in a calculated act to silence their message. But that message of justice, compassion, and hope couldn't be extinguished. The 1989 massacre shocked the world, exposing the brutal cost of El Salvador's civil war and the complicity of those who funded it. It also played a pivotal role in ending the conflict. The international outrage after the killings pressured both sides to negotiate. leading to the 1992 peace accords that finally silenced the guns. At UCA today, the campus is alive again. Its 12,000 students walking past a memorial garden where roses bloom in honor of the fallen. The priest's writings are required reading, their ideas on liberation theology inspiring a new generation to fight for the marginalized. A small plaque marks the spot where Julia Elba Ramos and her daughter Selena were found, their names etched alongside the priests, a reminder that the war spared no one. El Salvador still wrestles with its past. Poverty, corruption, and the echoes of violence linger, but the courage of those 8 souls shows that even in the darkest moments, a spark of defiance can light the way. The 2020 conviction of Inocente Orlando Montano, 31 years later, proved that justice, though delayed, can prevail, giving hope to countless others seeking truth. Their legacy lives on in every student who dares to speak out, in every survivor who demands accountability, and in every heart that refuses to forget. This story hits deep, doesn't it? What do you think? Are there other truths from the war still waiting to be uncovered? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit that like button if this mystery moved you, and share to spread their story. Subscribe for more true crime deep dives, and check out our playlist for more stories to keep the suspense going. Let's honor the UCA martyrs by keeping their fight alive.